The night the Toronto financial world stopped talking was the same night Maxwell Thorne walked into the Royal York ballroom holding a hand that did not belong to any of them. She was not wearing a gown from Holt Renfrew. She was not from one of the old Rosedale families. She was not anyone the investors or board members or their carefully dressed wives would have recognized. They had read her name in the tabloids. The nanny, they called her. The woman who had somehow found her way into the Thorne household, into the life of the most guarded man in Canadian private equity, and stayed. Some of them had laughed when they heard it. Some of them had made phone calls. But on that April evening, Maxwell Thorne, who had never made a public statement that was not written by a communications team, stepped to the microphone without notes and said something none of them expected. Her name is Jenna Colville. 3 months ago, my son spoke for the first time in over a year. The only person in the room was her. He paused. The room was completely still. This evening, I'd ask everyone here to remember that numbers aren't the only thing worth protecting. The woman beside him did not look triumphant. She looked like she was trying very hard not to cry in front of 400 people who had spent weeks deciding she did not belong. But to understand how she got there, you have to go back to the morning she showed up at the Thorne estate on Elm Avenue with a second-hand tote bag and 2 years of unpaid physiotherapy bills behind her. 3 months earlier, Jenna Colville was not thinking about billionaires. She was thinking about her mother's next appointment. Patricia Colville had spent the better part of her 60s fighting back from a stroke that had taken the use of her left hand. The OHIP coverage helped, but the gaps were brutal. The specialized sessions her physiotherapist had recommended, the equipment for the home, the small expenses that accumulate around illness the way snow accumulates in February, quietly, then all at once. Jenna had been a kindergarten teacher for 7 years at a public school in East York. She was good at it, genuinely good, the kind of teacher children remembered years later, and parents requested by name. But when the district consolidated 3 schools into one, the seniority rules cut her first. No warning, no severance beyond what the contract required. Just a Thursday afternoon phone call and a Friday that felt like falling. She had her ECE certification, her years of experience, references that glowed. She had applied to 38 positions. She had interviews. She had callbacks and second rounds and then silence. The market was tighter than it had been in years, and meanwhile her mother's appointment ledger kept filling in. The temp nanny listing came through a placement agency downtown. 12 weeks, possible extension. The hourly rate was more than she had made teaching. She needed the money. She took the job. The house on Elm Avenue in Rosedale was the kind of place that looks restrained from the outside. Deep red brick, a wide porch, old oak trees, but opens into something enormous once you step through the door. High ceilings, rooms that felt like galleries, a formal dining room that appeared to seat 12 people who were never there. The housekeeper, a composed woman named Doris, who turned out to be Maxwell's mother rather than an employee, met Jenna at the door on her first morning and told her 3 things. Milo doesn't talk much anymore. He used to. Don't push him. She paused. The nanny's before you pushed. He doesn't do well with that. Another pause. And my son won't be home until after 7 most evenings. If you need anything, you come to me. Jenna nodded. She didn't ask questions she didn't yet have the right to ask. The child was in the kitchen when she found him, sitting at the island with a glass of apple juice and a picture book open in front of him. 6 years old. Dark hair. His father's serious eyes, a stillness about him that most children his age don't carry. He looked at her when she came in, and then looked back at the book. She didn't say hello. She didn't crouch down to his level and use the bright voice she knew from years of classroom work. She just pulled out the stool across from him, sat down, and looked at the same page he was looking at. The page had a red barn on it, fields behind the barn, a dog sitting near the fence. That dog looks cold, Jenna said, to no one in particular. Milo did not respond, but he didn't leave the room either. She learned quickly to measure things in small units with him. He would not speak, but he would tolerate her presence. He would not eat the lunch she prepared if she stood watching, but he would eat it once she moved to the window. He would not follow her anywhere, but he would drift, gradually, toward wherever she had settled. By the third day, he was sitting close enough that their elbows were nearly touching, while they both looked at a field guide to Ontario birds she had found on the lower shelf of the library. She didn't mention that she had placed it there herself. It was on the 8th day, a Thursday, just after 2 in the afternoon, that Milo said something. She had been reading aloud to herself, or pretending to, a chapter from a book she had picked up. The passage happened to mention a crow. "Crows remember faces," Milo said. Not loudly, not looking at her. His eyes were still on the page he was holding. Jenna kept her voice even, like a door held open without any ceremony. "They do. If you're rude to a crow, it'll tell the other crows." Milo thought about this. What if you're nice to them? Same thing, they remember that too. He was quiet again, but the quality of the quiet had changed. It was no longer the kind that kept her out. What Jenna did not know was that Maxwell Thorne had come home early that afternoon. A meeting canceled. He had come in through the side entrance and stood in the hallway outside the library, listening through the half-open door for nearly 4 minutes. He had heard his son's voice for the first time in 14 months. He did not go in. He stood very still, and then he walked back down the hallway and sat at his desk and put his hands flat on the surface and looked at the wall. The days that followed changed something in the household that was difficult to name. It was not that Milo suddenly became an easy child. It was more that he became a different kind of difficult, curious instead of closed, watching instead of absent. He started asking Jenna questions, about birds mostly, and then about weather, and then about things she hadn't expected a 6-year-old to ask, like whether leaves hurt when they fall. "I don't think they do," she told him honestly. "But I've never been a leaf, so I can't be certain." He seemed to find this an acceptable answer. Maxwell began coming home earlier. He didn't announce it. He would appear at 6:15 instead of 7:30, and Jenna would hear him in the kitchen, and Milo would drift toward the sound, and sometimes the three of them would end up at the kitchen island at the same time in a way that nobody had planned. The first time Maxwell spoke to her beyond logistics, beyond the schedule, the dietary notes his assistant had forwarded, the emergency contacts, was on a Tuesday evening when Milo had gone up to bed, and Jenna was washing up the cups from his bedtime cocoa. "He asked me today what a mortgage was," Maxwell said from the doorway. Jenna turned around. "What did you tell him?" "I told him it's a promise you make to a bank." "And?" "He said promises should be made to people, not banks." He paused. "He's 6. Jenna smiled. 6-year-olds are unreasonably wise sometimes. Maxwell looked at her for a moment, in the way people look when they have not been surprised in a long time and are finding the sensation unfamiliar. Then he said goodnight and went upstairs. She didn't read into it. She was careful not to read into things. But the conversations kept happening. In the kitchen, in the front hallway, in the garden where Jenna had started keeping Milo company in the late afternoons before the weather turned. Maxwell would find excuses to be nearby. She noticed this without naming it. One evening he found her in the garden alone after Milo had been called in by Doris for a bath. It was the last week of February, still cold, but the kind of cold that promises something on the other side. "Why did you become a nanny?" he asked. She looked up. "I'm a teacher, actually. This is temporary." "But you're good at this." "I'm good at working with children. That's different from being a nanny." He considered that. "What happened to your position?" She paused. It was a direct question and she chose to answer it directly. "School consolidation. I was cut. I've been looking, but it's a tight market right now." "And this covers the gap?" She could have given him a short answer. Instead, she said, "My mum's been in physiotherapy since her stroke. There are costs the coverage doesn't reach." Maxwell was quiet. Then he said, "My wife died 3 years ago. Sudden cardiac event. She was 34. Jenna looked at him. She didn't fill the silence with condolences, because the moment didn't feel like it needed them. It felt like a sentence he had been carrying and had finally put down in front of someone. "Milo was 3, he said. "He remembers her, but not the way I remember her. He has pieces." "That's its own kind of hard," Jenna said quietly. "To grieve someone differently than the person beside you." Maxwell looked at her. Yes. A pause. That's exactly what it is. They stayed there for another few minutes without talking, while the February cold settled around them. And it was the most comfortable silence Jenna had experienced in longer than she could measure. She was not naive. She knew the distance between her life and his. She had ridden the TTC to this job every morning. She knew her coat was 5 years old. She knew all the things that were plainly and practically true. But she also knew that Maxwell Thorne had just said something he did not say to many people. And that mattered, independent of everything else. What she did not know was that someone else had been watching. Arabella Whitmore had been watching for a long time. Arabella was everything the Rosedale world expected. Polished, well-connected, the kind of beautiful that costs money and discipline. She had been Cara Thorne's younger sister, and since Cara's death she had positioned herself as the person closest to the grief. She attended the memorials. She visited Milo. She circled Maxwell at every social occasion with the patience of someone who believed she was the obvious, inevitable answer to a very specific question. She had recommended the last 2 nannies. Both had left within a month. When she came to the house that first Saturday after Milo spoke, to drop off something for Doris, she said, though the pretext was thin, Arabella met Jenna in the front hallway and assessed her in the practiced, rapid way she assessed everything. "You're the new one," she said. "Just precisely. Jenna Colville, I started 3 weeks ago." Arabella smiled. "He mentions you." She said this with the emphasis that meant its opposite, and then she walked past Jenna toward the kitchen where Maxwell was making coffee. 2 weeks later, things shifted. It started with staff. The housekeeper who came on Tuesdays began looking at Jenna differently. Then Maxwell's assistant sent a message asking Jenna to confirm the dates of her previous employment. Routine, the message said, part of a standard review. Then Maxwell himself came home one evening with a quality to his silence that felt different from the comfortable kind. He found her in the library. "I need to ask you something," he said. Jenna closed the book she was holding. "Did you know, when you took this position, that your mother had worked for Meridian Partners?" The question landed in the room like something dropped from a height. She had not told him. She had told no one. And the fact that he was asking meant someone else had told him first, which meant whatever was coming next would be shaped entirely by how she answered. She did not look away. "Yes," she said, "I knew." The muscle in his jaw moved. "My mother was a financial analyst at Meridian for 11 years, Jenna continued. She was fired 16 years ago and accused of falsifying records. She spent the rest of her life trying to clear her name. Her voice was steady. "I didn't come here to harm your family. I came because I needed the work. But when I saw the posting and realized the connection, I thought maybe I would find something that could help her. Some record, some trace," she paused. "I never went into your office. I never touched any of your files. I just wanted to understand." Maxwell looked at her for a long moment. His face was the kind of careful that hurt to look at. "And if you had found something," he said, "I would have told you." She met his eyes. "I know that sounds convenient to say now, but I would have." He left without another word. The next morning, Arabella arrived at 8 o'clock with documents. Physical documents, printed and organized, presented to Maxwell in the formal dining room that had not been used for anything since Christmas. "She has been deceiving your family from the beginning," Arabella said. She looked sorry about it. She had practiced looking sorry. Her mother was implicated in the Meridian fraud. This woman came into your home with a connection to the single worst period in your company's history. That cannot be a coincidence. Doris was in the doorway. She had not been invited to this conversation. Maxwell looked at the documents. He looked at Arabella. He looked at the window. "She told me herself," he said last night. Arabella's composure held but barely. "She told you?" "She didn't hide it once I asked directly." He stood. "Arabella, I know what you're doing. I'm protecting your family." "No," his voice was even. "You're protecting something else." She left, but the damage was partly done. The board had heard rumors, a financial news site had run an item, and 2 major investors were asking questions about the Meridian connection that had now been linked to Thorne Capital by someone who should not have had access to those records. Someone was feeding information to the press. It was not Jenna. Jenna packed her bag on a Thursday morning. She didn't announce it. She simply decided that staying was causing harm she had not intended to cause, and she was not the kind of person who caused harm and called it love. She was in the front hallway with her coat and her tote bag when Milo came down the stairs. He looked at her bag. He looked at her face. "Are you leaving?" he asked. She crouched down to his level, naturally now, the way she had learned he didn't mind anymore. "I was thinking about it. Because of the mean things people said?" She kept her voice level, a little bit. Milo was quiet. Then crows remember when you're nice too. She didn't cry in front of him. She was very careful about that. But she also put her bag down. Not because she had solved anything, but because a 6-year-old had reminded her what it meant to be remembered accurately. Maxwell found her still in the hallway when he returned from a noon meeting. He stopped when he saw the bag beside her. Then, he sat down on the stairs, the CEO of one of the most watched private equity firms in the country, sitting on his own front stairs like a man who had used up all his formal posture and had none left. He looked up at her. "I had someone go into the Meridian archives yesterday," he said. "Independently. My own investigator, separate from the board process." He rubbed the back of his neck. "There are gaps in those records that have been there for 16 years. Things that don't add up. Bank transfers without a logical origin point." He paused. "Your mother wasn't the only one who thought something was wrong. She was just the one who said it out loud." Jenna sat down on the step beside him, not close enough. "She wrote to the board 3 times before they let her go," Jenna said quietly. "I have the letters. I've had them for years." "I know. My investigator found references to them." He looked at her. "Jenna, I'm sorry it took me this long too." "You didn't know." "I should have asked more questions before I let anyone into this house to make accusations." She looked at the floor. "I should have told you sooner about Meridian." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Can I see the letters?" he asked. She looked at him. Yes. Gerald Hutchins had worked in human resources at Meridian Partners for 22 years before the company was absorbed into Thorne Capital. He was 73 now, living in Burlington, and he had kept a filing cabinet in his spare room that his wife had been asking him to clear out for a decade. He had kept it because he knew what was in it. He had also known, when he read the name Colville in a financial news article 3 days earlier, Jenna Colville, the woman connected to the Thorne Capital controversy, that he had waited long enough. He called the number listed for Thorne Capital's legal team. He asked to speak to Maxwell directly. He was told that would not be possible. He called back the next morning and said he had records from the Meridian Partners fraud investigation that had never been submitted to the original inquiry. He was put through within 4 minutes. On a Friday afternoon, Gerald sat in the formal dining room and laid out 22 years of careful record-keeping on the mahogany table. The transfers, the shell accounts, the internal memos that had been routed around Patricia Colville rather than through her, so that her name appeared connected to transactions she had never authorized, and the signature on the authorization forms, not Patricia's. The signature belonged to Langford Whitmore, Arabella's father, a founding partner of Meridian who had negotiated a silent advisory role at Thorne Capital when the acquisition was finalized. A man who had been a board voice for 16 years, who had always known, what his daughter was doing when she brought those documents to Maxwell's dining room. The room went completely still. Maxwell looked at the papers, then he looked at Jenna, who was sitting at the far end of the table with her hands folded and her face very still. "She carried this for 16 years, Doris said from the doorway. She had not been invited to this one either. She had stopped letting that stop her. Patricia Colville carried it, and it cost her health and her reputation, and nobody in this room did anything." Maxwell looked at his mother. "You didn't know," Doris said to him, and her voice was not unkind. "But you know now." Langford Whitmore was removed from the board by end of business that day. The RCMP Financial Crimes Unit received a referral the following Monday. Arabella, who had knowingly used falsified versions of her father's documents to present to Maxwell, was charged separately. The article circulating in the financial press was traced to a communications firm connected to the Whitmore family. It was retracted without comment. The night of the Thorne Capital Annual Gala, Jenna wore a blue dress she had owned since a friend's wedding 4 years ago. It fit the same. She had done her own hair. She had considered not going at all. Maxwell had asked 3 times. The 4th time he did not ask. He simply said, "I would like you to be there, not as Milo's nanny, as yourself." She went. The Royal York Ballroom held 400 people who had all read some version of the story. She felt them reading her as she walked in. She kept her hands quiet at her sides and looked straight ahead and thought about crows. When Maxwell took the microphone and said her name, her whole name, Jenna Colville, she felt the shift in the room, the held breath of people recalculating. Afterward, one of the older board members, a woman named Patricia, which Jenna noted with a private, grief-struck recognition, took her hand and said, "Your mother would be glad." She did not trust her voice to respond. She just nodded. Later that evening, Doris found her in the hotel corridor away from the noise. "He's been a different person for 3 months, Doris said. "I noticed it before I even knew your name." "Milo changed things," Jenna said. Doris gave her the look mothers give when they know more than they intend to say. "Yes," she said gently, "Milo helped." The question Maxwell asked her was not in any ballroom. It was in the back garden of the house on Elm Avenue, on a Saturday evening in May when the oak trees had finally come back, and Milo was asleep upstairs, and Doris had gone to her sister's for the weekend. It was simple. Maxwell Thorne, who made complicated things look effortless, and who had spent 3 years building walls high enough that people stopped trying, sat beside Jenna on the garden bench and said, "Stay." She turned to look at him. "Not for Milo, not for the house, for me." He paused. "I know what I'm asking." She thought about her mother, who had spent 16 years fighting alone. She thought about Milo saying that promises should be made to people, not banks. She thought about the silence in February that had felt, unexpectedly, like the most honest conversation she had had in years. "You're not asking too much," she said. "You're asking the right thing." He reached for her hand. The gesture was quiet and unperformed and entirely his. She did not pull away. A year later, the house on Elm Avenue had a different quality to it, noisier, more complicated in the way that good things are complicated. Milo had started grade 1 and was, by general teacher consensus, the child most likely to stop a lesson mid-sentence to point out a crow on the windowsill. He was also, according to his teacher, unusually kind. Doris said she had never been surprised by that. Jenna had gone back to teaching, part-time first, then full-time, at a school 3 streets from the house. She kept her own apartment for 6 months because she needed to, and then she didn't need to anymore, and she let it go without ceremony. The night she put Milo to bed and he said, unprompted, that he had told his friend today that his family had 3 people and a grandma. She stood in the hallway afterward and covered her mouth with her hand and breathed. Maxwell found her there. What happened? She shook her head, not in a way that meant nothing, in a way that meant something she didn't have words for yet. He put his arm around her, and they stood in the hallway of that enormous, finally warm house together, in the particular quiet of a home where a child is sleeping, and the worst of it is genuinely, really over. The lawyers filed the compensation paperwork for Patricia Colville's estate in the spring. It was processed without contest. Nobody could give Jenna her mother back. Nobody could return the 16 years Patricia had spent carrying a weight that wasn't hers. But when Jenna stood at her mother's grave in late April and said, out loud to no one who could hear her, "They know the truth now, Mum," she believed it, every single word. That is what justice looks like sometimes. Not a trial on the evening news, not a headline, just a daughter standing in the spring rain in a Toronto cemetery, finally able to say, she was not who they said she was. And the world slowly beginning to agree.